So a little about me. I'm a giant fan of Death Note and I have a bachelor's in fine arts. So you best believe I was stoked when I heard there was a manga out there that was essentially Death Note but about art. After having read the first 3 books, I can tell you with decent confidence that this series is not really anything like Death Note, other than a few similarities between Light Yagami and this main character. Was I disappointed though? Not at all, because what I found was still incredibly fresh and something I never knew I wanted. So, without further ado, let's talk about Blue Period. But before we get started, I'd like to welcome you to MangAnalysis, where I do little reviews of certain mangas that I like. If you like what you see and would like to hear more, please make sure to subscribe and leave a like. Please leave a comment if you have anything to add to this little review, and maybe let's get a conversation going. So before we start too deep, let's start with a little bit of a summary. Blue Period, a manga series by Tsubasa Yamaguchi, starts like most other series, with a big hard look at our protagonist. Yatora Yaguchi is your typical teenager, coasting through life with no particular interests. He gets good grades because that's what's expected of him. He likes sports and parties because that's what's expected of him. He doesn't really want anything from life, and that's how he thinks things should be. He's just indifferent to it all. All this changes, however, when one day he decides to take art class seriously instead of napping, and what he finds leaves him in awe. He's actually into it. Passion doesn't find him immediately though, but he's interested enough to pursue that feeling. He begins learning about painting and all of its intricacies, along with how the art world operates. For the first time in his life, Yatora finds something, and he's not about to give it up. So the first thing that really gripped me about Blue Period is in its portrayal of the other artists in the series. Throughout the story, Yatora gets to meet a variety of artists. Some are really passionate about their art, while others paint more out of a hobby. Some know exactly who they are artistically, while others are struggling to find out their identity. Some are more into looking at art in museums and critiquing them, rather than actually producing art, while others, like Yatora, have no idea how to even go about critiquing someone else's painting. It really reminded me of my experience in art school since I was surrounded by so many different people. But again, they're written really well. This series doesn't exoticize artists, they're just seen as people like you and me. And I think that's really cool. Finally, I can relate to another artist in some show and he's not some weird serial killer or perv or something. He's just some guy, and I think that's great. The second thing about this series that really intrigued me was in its realistic depiction of Yatora's artistic journey and development. When he decides he wants to become an artist, he gives himself a year or so to get better. When he decides that he wants to become an artist, he applies himself the same way he would have in a math test. He works hard, goes about it very methodically, but is distraught to find that working that way doesn't necessarily yield the results he's hoping for. From there, he learns that art is about a lot more than just sitting there and drawing still lives, practicing the same thing over and over again, like you might want to do if you were studying math or literature or something. He learns that there will be a time when you plateau. When that happens, you need to get out of your comfort zone and try something new. Yatora acknowledges this and moves from drawing to painting, hoping for better results. But again, he gets better, but not necessarily where he wants to be. That's when he learns that art is about more than just producing. It's about looking, understanding, replicating, interpreting, and so many more things. It's only when he can apply all those elements together that he will see some real growth. It was really interesting to see a fictional character go through more or less the same path that I went through all those years ago. I was expecting the series to portray Yatora as a prodigy or have him come out of his first year as an absolute boss or the best artist in Japan, but he's not. He's just some guy that's better at drawing and painting than he was about a year ago, which I find really cool. I would also like to add that I find that, taking a year to get better at drawing is relatively realistic. If the series would have made Yatora go from having drawn nothing at all to painting really good portraits in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks, I would have been pretty disappointed, because unless you're incredibly gifted, that's most likely not going to happen. You have to put effort and you have to be willing to put the time, and that's what this character did, and I can really appreciate that as, again, someone who's had to do that. On to the third thing that I really like about this series, and this is a pretty big one. If you're new to art and you're genuinely into learning about it, this manga is excellent. It goes through so many concepts, and not only does it go into detail, it usually finds a way to incorporate it into Yatora's development. This story goes through piece composition, tones, values, color, which is funny seeing as how this is a series in black and white. More on that later. It goes through materials, differences between paints, and so many other things. So many things are mentioned in this series, and they're all explained pretty well. You could surf YouTube for hours trying to learn artistic concepts, or you could just read this series. Well, maybe not to that extent. But for a beginner, this can genuinely teach you great and valuable lessons. I will say, however, that this could actually be kind of a turnoff for some. If you're already familiar with all those concepts and you're an artist yourself, you might find the first book a little long. Everything I read in the first book are things that I knew due to my education. I do have a teaching background though, and teaching art is something I'd like to do. So I was too busy being impressed with the teaching lessons to mind all of the exposition. But I can see how this could be bothersome for some people who are just looking for a story and not necessarily tutorials on how to do something they already know how to do. Another really cool thing this series delves into is the art world itself. Blue Period goes through the competitive nature of getting into art schools, from building a portfolio tailored to the specific school you're applying to, or just sort of trying to go your own way. It also goes through the concept of the artist that was really good in high school, but then turns out they're just okay in a university or college setting. Hey, that was me. Cool side note though, all the art featured in this series that are made by the other characters or just shown in museums are actually pieces of art made by real Japanese artists. Some are professionals and others are just students throughout Japan, which I thought was really neat. Alright, so for all the good this series offers, I must mention one thing that I disliked about it, and this is obviously my own opinion. Ironically enough, I don't really like the art style. It was actually somewhat of a deterrent at first. It made it difficult for me to get into it. Now, I just want to say that I do not think that Tsubasa Yamaguchi, the author and artist for this series, is by no means a bad artist. It's just not necessarily my cup of tea. I'm sure that many people out there love their work, and that's great. It's just not necessarily my favorite. I'd also like to add that there's this watercolor filter added to the screen tones, which is interesting but doesn't really add anything. It's more like a gimmick that you'd expect to see in some watercolor presentation on PowerPoint. I feel like I understand why it's there, because the main protagonist starts his journey with watercolor and experiments a lot with it, so maybe it's sort of like a thematic thing. However, I just don't really feel like it's done super well. It looks a little artificial at times. One artist that does the whole watercolor tones thing really well, it's Tsutomu Takahashi, and he gets away with doing them really well because he does the entirety of the toning just using diluted ink washes. However, the biggest gripe I have with the art style is how much it's limited by its medium. A story about art and the joys of colors should be in color, not black and white. It tries to make up for it with vivid descriptions, but alas, it isn't very effective. The good news is that apparently Blue Period will get made into an anime sometime in 2021. I can't wait to see the series come to life with color, and hopefully that gripe of mine fades away. Alright, so with that out of the way, where is the series headed? I'm curious to see where it's going to go. Yatora is trying to get into art school surrounded by much more experienced artists than he is, and some of them have failed to get into on their first attempts. Is he gonna pull out some giant art epiphany and rise above the competition like we saw in Hikaru no Go? Or is it going to take the Haikyuu approach and have him taste the bitter taste of failure and use it as a motivation to become even better? So in the end, if you're looking for something new and atypical to the whole shonen thing, I would highly recommend this series. If you read and enjoyed Bakuman, I think you would enjoy this one as well. The story's paced very well so far, and the characters are incredibly believable. If you're an artist yourself and wish to see what your art journey could have looked like, or even if you're a beginner and want to see what your journey could look like, I think this manga could be the next one for you. Well, that was Blue Period. I hope you enjoyed this little review, and if you did indeed enjoy it, consider subscribing. This was Manga Analysis, and I'll see you in the next one.